New York City is always getting criticized by the suburbs. Suburbanites oftentimes were urbanites who moved out to the suburbs because they didn't want to pay high rents and they wanted a yard.
Hi there, it's WAMC News Director Ian Pickus. And on this episode of the WAMC News Podcast, a closer look at the strife between New York City and its surrounding suburbs. The states of emergency and lawsuits that several New York counties put in place to stop New York City from busing an overflow of asylum seekers upstate is just one example of a growing divide between the Big Apple and its surrounding localities. That's according to a new report in the New York Times by Jesse McKinley, who also points to housing, crime, and congestion pricing as flashpoints.
All that had to happen here would be some honesty and clarity from the city asking us.
My folks are already stretched to the breaking point.
I don't believe he has that authority. It's bigger than the migrant issue for me.
McKinley is a Metro reporter and a familiar voice on WAMC from his years covering the New York State Capitol, and he joins us now. So is this dynamic between town and gown, as it were, anything new?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there has long been tension between the suburbs and the city. You know, this dates back decades and decades and decades. They have fought over everything from tolling on the bridges to tolling on the tunnels to school funding to MTA funding. There has long been flashpoints. But what we've been seeing in the last couple of months is kind of a slow buildup of a number of issues kind of colliding over, things like congestion pricing and the affordable housing plan. And of course, as you mentioned, the migrant plan, which really upset a lot of upstate counties on both sides of the aisle. This was not uniformly a Republican opposition. A lot of Democrats were bent out of joint by this as well. So you add this all up and you've got a very tense, very fraught relationship between the city, which of course is vitally important to the region's economy and culture and social life, and the suburbs, which more and more feels like the problems of the city are simply not their problems.
How much of this comes down to Mayor Eric Adams' approach in governance and communication?
I think you keyed in on something. I think communication is the big one here. I think what upset a lot of Hudson Valley as well as upstate county leaders, county executives, as well as municipality officials was the lack of communication on the migrant issue, that this seemed to be suddenly thrust upon them with little or no advance warning. And keep in mind that, politics rolls downhill. So for a lot of these guys and women who were running counties, they suddenly had to explain to their constituents why migrants from New York City, oftentimes from hundreds of miles away, were suddenly being deposited in motels in their region. Now, keep in mind, New York City was picking up the bill. Some of the cities, places like Albany, which is a sanctuary city, accepted these people happily, or at least, with the spirit of good neighborliness. But other places like Rockland County, where Ed Day, a Republican, is a former New York City police commander, were very upset by the way the city handled this, and particularly upset that they didn't get a heads up.
Let's bring Governor Hochul into the conversation now. It's easy to remember in the last regime, Governor Andrew Cuomo and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, there was not a lot of love lost there. And at times, they certainly played up the divide in order to advance their own positions. How do you think Governor Hochul is handling the sort of upstate, downstate divide you're reporting on?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think there's two answers. One is that Hochul's governance style is obviously very different than her predecessor. She tends to be a little bit less kind of power politics and stuff like this. She tends to try to seek consensus. But I think one thing that is interesting is that she is not from New York City. She is a Buffalonian, whereas Governor Cuomo was, a Queens guy. And I think the more I think about this, sometimes that is what's going on here, too, is that the seat of power, the top dog in the state, is not a New Yorker per se, or New York Cityan per se. So perhaps the power dynamic is different there too, But I think by and large, Hochul's biggest disappointment probably goes down to the affordable housing plan, which she had hoped to build 800,000 units across the state, but in large part to alleviate affordable housing problems in New York City. And that got completely torpedoed by suburban lawmakers who kind of, quite frankly, adopted a NIMBY approach to that plan and didn't want these large developments happening in their communities. So that was another flashpoint between suburban and urban.
And they were also not shy about the congestion pricing plan, which brings New Jersey to the table, too. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, I mean, the congestion pricing plan, which dates actually back to the Cuomo administration as well, is a plan to basically charge a toll anywhere, I will think, from $9 to $23 on drivers coming into the lower half of Manhattan, any place south of 60th Street. You know, that has also been, it was a theory that was tested in London and has been quite successful in both reducing traffic and raising funds. And I think for the people who were advocating for it here, it seemed to be a great idea. You know, you'd raise money and you'd simultaneously kind of eliminate gridlock in Midtown Manhattan. But for New Jerseyites, many of whom commute to the city, this was viewed as yet another onerous tax on their livelihoods, you know, that they have to come into the city to fill these offices, which of course have had trouble refilling post-pandemic, and that they were going to get dinged with another fee. And this has been a bipartisan opposition. Like, Democrats in New Jersey do not like this plan, including Governor Murphy, Josh Gottheimer, who's a prominent congressman in northern New Jersey. Both Democrats have spoken out against this, and it's really, you know, exacerbated and illuminated this divide, right, where suburbanites need cars. They need to get around, and urbanites don't. And therefore, from a suburban viewpoint, it's seen as New Yorkers just not understanding the way and quality of life of New Jerseyans.
Let's talk now about crime. Obviously, a huge issue in the last New York State election in November. It's also, I think, has to be said, a very safe time, historically speaking, to live in New York City. But how is crime playing into the dynamic that you've been covering?
Well, most kind of notably, it played in politics. It played very centrally in the last election cycle when Republicans just beat the bejesus out of that issue vis-a-vis Democrats, and in New York at least flipped 4 congressional seats, in large part because of public safety concerns, real or imagined or created by, you know, whipping up high-profile stories into some evidence that New York City is becoming a cesspool. Now, as you pointed out, you look at the statistics, there obviously was an increase in crime, but some of the more violent categories have declined. So once again, this comes down to perception, but it has been a very potent issue for Republicans, and I think it will continue to be an issue that they run on in 24 when a lot of these congressional seats will be in play again.
Do you see anything that the state legislature did in the just completed session as changing that dynamic for Democrats?
Well, once again, yes and no. I think that Democrats, do actually have hopes in the courts of perhaps even redrawing those maps again for 24. There's a case, I believe, pending in New York, although I am not a lawyer. I play one on TV, but I do not know exactly what that case is. But that may hold out some hope for redistricting for Democrats. But I think certainly, bail reform was an issue that Hochul really wanted some changes on. I think in large part because she got slammed for not handling crime as a good issue in her own election campaign, and at least from National Democrats' perspective, costing seats in relatively safe areas, or at least in a very deep blue state, and thereby helping the Republicans take control of the House of Representatives. So I think bail reform in particular was a place where Hochul really pushed for and did in fact get some concessions on a public safety issue that she felt was politically damaging to her and other Democrats.
So getting ready to speak with you and reading your story, I was thinking about a piece we did the other day about the latest tax collections in New York State as reported by the New York State Comptroller, where just about all of the counties upstate didn't grow as fast in tax collections in the last year-over-year period that the comptroller measured. And New York City grew so much that it buoyed the entire state. So as New York City goes, so goes the rest of the state. And it kind of helps us who don't live in New York paper over some shortcomings in terms of state coffers and so on, which is a long way of asking you, New York City is going to be fine, isn't it?
Yeah, I like to quote the talking heads, same as it ever was. What is interesting about this is New York City is always getting criticized by the suburbs. Suburbanites oftentimes were urbanites who moved out to the suburbs because they didn't want to pay high rents and they wanted a yard and they wanted a playground for their kids to play in. So griping about the city is almost as old as the city itself. And yet the city has shown remarkable resilience after all kinds of downturns, whether it be the Great Depression, whether it be 9/11. New York does tend to bounce back. And as its fortunes rise, so rise the suburbs, right? Because it creates jobs, it creates economic growth, it creates vibrancy that draws people to the area, both the immediate area inside the 5 boroughs and the surrounding areas. So New York continues to chug along. It's not going anywhere, but neither is the criticism probably from the suburbs.
That's New York Times Metro reporter Jesse McKinley, and you can read his coverage on the strife between New York City and the surrounding areas in the New York Times. Jesse, thanks as always for speaking with us. Great catching up.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Okay, that does it for this episode of the WAMC News Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Ian Pickus.